Donald Trump's tariffs were meant to bring Canada to the negotiating table from a position of weakness. Instead, they may have triggered something very different. What you're about to hear is not a discussion about military budgets, defense spending, or a routine government announcement. It's the story of a country publicly deciding that it no longer wants to depend on others for its security and future. Throughout the speech we're examining today, one word kept resurfacing. Not partnership, not cooperation, not alliance. The word was sovereignty. And in a room filled with defense industry leaders, military contractors, government officials, and executives, everyone understood that this wasn't simply diplomatic language. It carried a much deeper meaning. My name is Jim Blanchard, and this is Canada Expansion. Stay with us until the end, because by the time we're finished, you'll understand not only what Canada announced, but why it made this decision, what it could mean for Canadians, and what it reveals about the country's direction moving forward. Before we get into the policies, the investments, and the strategy behind all of this, I want to start with a simple question. If your country's closest ally, the nation you've shared a border with for generations, the country deeply connected to your economy, suddenly began using economic pressure against you, what would you do? Would you try to maintain the relationship? Would you negotiate and compromise? Would you push back? Or would you choose a different path altogether and build something that could never be taken away from you? That's the question Canada has been grappling with quietly over the last year and a half. And what we're discussing today is Canada's answer to that question. But before we go further, I'd like to hear your thoughts. If you were leading a country facing this kind of pressure, would you work to preserve the existing relationship? Or would you focus on building a new future independently? Leave your answer in the comments, because by the end of this video, you may see the situation differently. To understand why this moment matters, we need to look at where Canada stood only a couple of years ago. For decades, Canada operated under a set of assumptions that became so familiar, most people never stopped to question them. The first assumption was that the global trading system was stable and predictable, governed by rules that major economies, including the United States, would continue to respect. The second assumption was that NATO and the broader alliance system were permanent, that collective defense was based on shared commitments rather than transactions, and that Washington would remain a dependable ally. The third assumption, perhaps the most significant of all, was that Canada didn't need to build everything itself. It was considered practical and economically efficient to rely on American technology, American defense systems, and American supply chains for many of the critical elements tied to Canadian security and prosperity. For a long time, these assumptions seemed reasonable. Canada built one of the world's highest standards of living. It developed strong institutions and created an economy that became deeply integrated with that of the United States. By 2024, roughly 3/4 of all Canadian exports were heading south across the border. Think about that for a moment. For every $4 Canada earned from selling goods internationally, about 3 of those dollars depended on a single customer, a single neighbor, and ultimately a single government. For years, that arrangement appeared to work because the relationship was largely predictable. Then circumstances began to change. During late 2024 and into 2025, decisions coming out of Washington started forcing Canada to rethink some of its most basic assumptions. Tariffs were imposed on steel. Tariffs were imposed on aluminum. Tariffs affected auto parts and industries that supported communities across Ontario and other parts of the country. But beyond the tariffs themselves, there was a shift in tone. Canadian leaders heard something coming from Washington that they hadn't experienced in decades. It was no longer simply the language of cooperation between allies. Increasingly, it sounded like leverage and pressure. The message seemed to be that Canada depended on the United States far more than the United States depended on Canada. And to be fair, there was some truth in that assessment. Canada's economy was heavily tied to American markets. The country relied on US-designed defense technology and American-controlled supply chains. For years, Canada had invested less in its own industrial and military capabilities than many now believe it should have. By 2025, this wasn't merely a strategic concern, It had become an economic vulnerability. The pressure was real, and nobody could deny that. But this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Pressure does not always create surrender. Sometimes it creates determination. Sometimes it forces a country to build strengths it previously neglected. And what Washington may have underestimated was Canada's response. Rather than accepting long-term dependence, Canada began moving toward a different goal. Instead of adjusting temporarily, it started asking how it could ensure it would never find itself in the same position again. That shift brings us to what Mélanie Joly actually said, and it's important to separate confirmed facts from interpretation. Joly is one of Canada's most senior ministers, and when she addressed a gathering of defense industry leaders, engineers, contractors, and executives, she wasn't delivering a campaign speech. She wasn't speaking to voters. She was speaking directly to the people responsible for designing, building, and delivering the technologies that shape national security. Rather than opening with a major policy announcement, she began with a lesson from history. Specifically, she went back to 1943. She reminded her audience that when Canada entered the Second World War, the country lacked the industrial capacity needed to sustain a modern war effort. It had to build that capability rapidly and almost from scratch, and that is exactly what it did. By the middle of 1943, nearly 900,000 Canadians, many of them women who had stepped into industrial roles while men served overseas, were producing extraordinary quantities of equipment every single week. Aircraft, vehicles, armored fighting units, ammunition, explosives, and countless other materials were rolling off production lines across the country. It was one of the most remarkable industrial transformations in Canadian history. Joly didn't tell that story as a history lesson or an exercise in nostalgia. She told it because she believed the lesson still mattered. The message was straightforward. Canada has built extraordinary industrial capacity before, and it can do it again. And from there, she delivered what may have been the most important statement of the entire speech. Not the loudest line, not the most dramatic, but perhaps the one that best explains everything that followed. She said, "Industrial strength is national strength." 5 simple words that set the tone for everything that came next. Those 5 words became the foundation for everything that followed. According to Joly, only 3 months before this speech, Canada launched what she described as the country's most significant industrial strategy since the Second World War. The scale of the plan immediately caught attention. The government outlined a projected investment of $500 billion and a goal of creating 125,000 well-paying jobs across Canada. In addition, more than $125 million in contracts had already been awarded to Canadian businesses during the first 3 months after the strategy was introduced. Those are the official numbers, and it's important to present them accurately. At the same time, it's equally important to recognize what they represent. The $500 billion figure and the projected job creation targets are government forecasts. They are objectives rather than guaranteed outcomes. Any responsible assessment has to acknowledge that distinction. Governments regularly announce ambitious plans, but success ultimately depends on implementation, infrastructure, execution, and long-term commitment. Still, regardless of whether every target is reached, the direction of the strategy is unmistakable. This initiative is about much more than funding. At its core, it is about ownership and control. For many years, when Canada needed advanced defense technology, it often turned to foreign suppliers. American systems, American intellectual property, and American supply chains played a major role in supporting Canadian security. That arrangement worked when relationships were stable and supply chains remained reliable. But when those conditions changed, vulnerabilities became more visible. The strategy Joly described is intended to reduce those vulnerabilities. The objective, stated clearly during the speech, is to create intellectual property inside Canada, developed by Canadians and controlled by Canadians, and then bring those technologies to international markets. In other words, the goal is not simply to purchase advanced defense systems from abroad. The goal is to design, build, and export them. That represents a major shift in how Canada sees its role within the global defense economy. Another significant part of the strategy involves a new classification system for defense companies. Canada has established what it calls a strategic partner designation, and the requirements for receiving that designation reveal a great deal about the kind of industrial base the government hopes to develop. To qualify, a company must first be genuinely Canadian, not simply operating in Canada, not a foreign-owned subsidiary with a local office, but a truly Canadian company. Second, the company must contribute to what Joly referred to as key sovereign capabilities. These are technologies and systems that Canada believes it must be able to develop, control, and maintain independently. Third, the company must have demonstrated its ability to complete complex projects successfully and reliably. Promises alone are not enough. Delivery matters. Fourth, the company must create quality jobs for Canadians and strengthen local communities rather than shifting opportunities elsewhere. And fifth, the company must operate with integrity and reflect Canadian values. That final requirement stands out because it goes beyond technical qualifications. It reflects a broader vision. Canada is signaling that the organizations responsible for supporting national security are expected to be more than contractors. They are expected to be trusted partners in shaping the country's future. Joly made it clear that receiving strategic partner status carries significant meaning. It identifies a company as one that Canada intends to work closely with in advancing some of its most important defense and security priorities. This is not simply an economic designation. It is tied directly to national security, and in many ways it marks a substantial shift in approach. Of course, no strategy exists without the companies expected to carry it forward. Joly highlighted several examples that demonstrate what this vision looks like in practice. In Atlantic Canada, she pointed to Kraken Robotics, a company developing advanced underwater surveillance technologies. These systems play a critical role in monitoring coastlines, protecting underwater infrastructure, and tracking potential threats beneath the ocean surface. What makes the company notable within this discussion is that the technology is being developed in Canada by Canadian engineers using Canadian intellectual property. It is not a foreign system being imported or licensed. It is being built domestically. Moving to Northern Ontario, Joly highlighted TPS Canada, which recently announced the acquisition of advanced jet trainers intended to expand NATO pilot training operations in North Bay. The significance of that move extends beyond Canada's own military requirements. It positions Canada as a location where allied nations can send pilots for training. Rather than sitting on the edge of the alliance, Canada is placing itself closer to the center of key NATO activities. In Western Canada, Joly referenced Avroland and its role in supporting Canada's long-standing aerospace sector. Through both civilian and defense-related operations, companies like these contribute to strengthening Canada's ability to manage critical aerospace capabilities independently. It is part of a broader effort to ensure that important infrastructure and expertise remain under Canadian control. Most Canadians may not recognize these company names immediately. They are not the massive multinational defense corporations that dominate headlines. Yet these are the organizations developing technologies, managing operations, and creating the intellectual property that could shape Canada's security landscape for decades to come. The purpose of the Strategic Partner Framework is to identify more companies like them, help them grow, and ensure they have the support necessary to meet future national needs. And according to Joly, that work cannot wait for some distant future. It has already begun. One part of the speech that may not have generated major headlines could end up being one of the most significant. Joly explained that Canada's defense industrial strategy is not only about military capability. It also acknowledges the human impact of the ongoing trade conflict. She stated that defense investments are being used intentionally to support workers, families, and communities that have been affected by tariffs, particularly in sectors such as automotive manufacturing, steel, and aluminum production. That point deserves attention because the tariffs imposed from Washington were aimed directly at industries that form the economic backbone of many Canadian communities. These are not just sectors on a chart. They represent real people, real families, and entire regions whose livelihoods depend on stable employment. Canada's response is not simply to absorb those losses. Instead, the strategy seeks to redirect industrial capacity toward new opportunities. Manufacturing expertise that once served automotive supply chains can now contribute to aerospace, defense technologies, and advanced industrial production. Skills developed over decades in precision manufacturing do not disappear when one sector faces disruption. They can be transferred to new industries that require the same level of expertise and technical knowledge. Imagine a worker in Windsor whose job was connected to a cross-border automotive supply chain that has become less reliable because of tariffs and trade tensions. The abilities that worker developed, precision engineering, advanced manufacturing, complex assembly processes, are exactly the kinds of skills needed in modern defense and aerospace production. In that sense, the challenge becomes an opportunity. The disruption becomes a transition. The pressure creates momentum for something new. Looking back years from now, this may be the aspect of the strategy people remember most. Not necessarily the large spending projections or the employment targets, but the recognition that economic policy, industrial development, and national security are becoming increasingly connected. For a long time, those conversations existed separately. Defense policy focused on military needs, trade policy focused on commerce, industrial policy focused on economic growth. That separation is fading. The government is openly treating these issues as interconnected parts of a single national strategy, and it is doing so deliberately. I also want to bring this discussion closer to everyday life, because many of the numbers we have discussed can feel distant and abstract. Hundreds of billions of dollars, industrial strategies, sovereign capabilities, defense investments. These concepts can seem removed from daily experience. But the reality is that many Canadians have already felt the consequences of the changes that led to this strategy. They have felt it at grocery stores.
They have noticed it when filling up their vehicles. They have experienced it every time another headline appeared about escalating trade tensions, and they wondered how those developments might affect their finances. That uncertainty, that sense that economic conditions were becoming less predictable, is directly connected to the larger story we are discussing. Tariffs affecting steel influence manufacturing costs. Disruptions in automotive supply chains affect communities across Ontario and beyond. Decisions made far outside Canada's borders can have direct consequences for Canadian households. What is happening now is that Canada is attempting to turn those disruptions into a source of future growth. The contracts being awarded to companies such as Kraken Robotics and TPS Canada create employment opportunities in Canadian communities. The more than $125 million already distributed through programs such as Innovative Solutions Canada is supporting Canadian engineers, manufacturers, and innovators. The intellectual property being developed under this strategy remains in Canada, generates value in Canada, and helps create long-term economic opportunities in Canada. That is why Jolie argues this initiative extends far beyond defense alone. In her view, it is also about economic growth, resilience, and national development. The same pressures that exposed vulnerabilities are now being used to justify investments intended to strengthen Canada's future. Whether the strategy ultimately achieves every goal being promised is a question that only time can answer. But the shift itself is real. The investments are real. And perhaps most importantly, the way Canada is thinking about its economic and security future appears to be changing in a fundamental way. At this point, it is important to step back and view the situation through a wider lens. Framing this entirely as a Canada versus Trump story would miss the larger trend. What Canada is experiencing today reflects a broader shift taking place around the world. Over the last several years, many countries have been forced to confront a reality that decades of globalization often obscured. Economic integration creates benefits, but it can also create dependence. Supply chains that cross borders can be disrupted. Critical technologies developed elsewhere can become inaccessible. Markets that appear reliable can suddenly become sources of leverage. Canada is far from alone in confronting these challenges. European nations have been rethinking energy security. Taiwan lives with the realities of semiconductor dependence and geopolitical pressure. Japan and South Korea have both intensified efforts to strengthen domestic industrial capacity.
Around the world, governments are placing greater emphasis on resilience, strategic industries, and economic sovereignty. What makes Canada's situation distinctive is not that it is happening, but how quickly it appears to be happening, and how openly Canadian leaders are discussing it. This shift was not driven primarily by theoretical policy papers or academic recommendations. It was driven by a direct economic experience that many Canadians felt in their daily lives. Canada did not move toward greater sovereignty simply because experts suggested it would be wise. It moved in that direction because it experienced vulnerability firsthand and decided it wanted to reduce the risk of facing the same situation again. Lessons learned through real-world consequences often leave a lasting impact, and that is why this moment may prove significant, regardless of the exact outcomes of the current strategy. What we are witnessing may represent more than a change in policy.
It may represent a change in how Canada understands itself and its place in the world. For perhaps the first time in many years, Canadian leaders are speaking less about managing relationships and more about deliberately building national capacity. That shift in perspective has the potential to influence not only how other countries view Canada, but also how Canadians view their own future. Now, I want to be completely fair about what we've discussed, because this channel isn't here to promote government announcements or celebrate policy decisions without asking tough questions. There are legitimate concerns surrounding this strategy, and those concerns deserve serious consideration. One of the biggest questions is whether Canada can actually build the kind of sovereign industrial base being promised. Announcing a strategy is one thing. Delivering it is something entirely different. Defense industries are not created through speeches alone. They require long-term procurement commitments, efficient regulations, highly skilled workers, private investment, political stability, and sustained support that continues beyond a single government or election cycle. The projected $500 billion investment and the goal of creating 125,000 jobs are ambitious targets, but targets are not guarantees. History has shown that even well-designed plans can run into obstacles.
Supply chain disruptions, economic downturns, changing political priorities, budget pressures, and global market conditions all have the potential to affect outcomes. That doesn't mean the strategy is destined to fail. It simply means that announcements should not be confused with results. Another important question involves timing. What happens if the circumstances that helped create this sense of urgency begin to change? If tariff tensions ease in the future, if relations between Ottawa and Washington become less confrontational, and if economic pressure begins to fade, will Canada maintain the same level of commitment? Will future governments continue investing at this scale once the immediate crisis feels more distant? That may be one of the most important questions of all, because industrial strategies are measured in decades, not news cycles. Building new capabilities, developing intellectual property, expanding manufacturing capacity, and creating entire industrial ecosystems takes time. Success depends on consistency. It depends on staying committed even when the political environment becomes less urgent. Yet, despite those uncertainties, one thing seems increasingly clear. Something has changed in the way Canada is approaching its future. Whether every objective is achieved or not, the conversation itself has shifted. The language being used by Canadian leaders today is noticeably different from the language that dominated discussions only a few years ago. There is a greater emphasis on resilience, self-reliance, domestic capacity, and national control over critical industries. That change did not happen in isolation. It emerged from a period of economic pressure, trade disputes, supply chain disruptions, and growing awareness that dependence can carry risks. And once a country begins rethinking those assumptions, it often becomes difficult to return to the old way of thinking. This is why the speech matters, not because of any single funding announcement, not because of a specific contract or program. It matters because it reflects a broader shift in mindset. Canada is increasingly framing its future around the idea that sovereignty requires more than political independence. It requires industrial capability. It requires ownership of critical technologies. It requires the ability to build, innovate, and compete on its own terms. Around the world, governments are reaching similar conclusions. Economic security and national security are becoming harder to separate. Countries are investing more heavily in domestic industries, critical infrastructure, advanced manufacturing, and technological independence. Canada's strategy fits within that larger global trend, but it also reflects a uniquely Canadian response to recent events.
What makes this moment particularly significant is the speed at which the discussion has evolved. Only a short time ago, many of these ideas existed mainly in policy circles and strategic reports. Today, they are being discussed publicly by senior government officials as central elements of Canada's future direction. That tells us something important about how decision-makers view the challenges ahead. Canada appears to be moving toward a model that places greater value on domestic capability, long-term resilience, and economic independence. Whether that transition succeeds will depend on countless decisions that have yet to be made. It will depend on businesses, workers, investors, governments, and institutions all moving in the same direction over an extended period of time. There will undoubtedly be setbacks. There will be disagreements about priorities, spending, and execution. That is true of every major national project. But regardless of how the details unfold, this speech offers a glimpse into how Canada's leadership is thinking about the future. It suggests that the country is no longer content simply to react to global events. Instead, it wants to play a more active role in shaping its own economic and strategic destiny. And perhaps that is the most important takeaway from everything we've discussed today. This story is not ultimately about one politician, one administration, or even one trade dispute. It is about a country reassessing long-held assumptions and deciding how it wants to move forward in a world that feels increasingly uncertain. The tariffs may have been the catalyst, the trade tensions may have accelerated the process, but the larger story is about how Canada responded. Rather than focusing solely on the immediate challenge, it began asking a broader question. How can the country become stronger, more resilient, and less vulnerable in the years ahead? The answer being proposed is ambitious, expensive, and far from guaranteed. But it represents a vision for Canada that is fundamentally different from the one that existed only a few years ago. Whether that vision becomes reality remains to be seen. What cannot be denied is that the conversation has changed. And when the conversation changes, the future often changes with it. As always, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Canada can successfully build the kind of sovereign industrial capacity being discussed here? Do you think this strategy will strengthen the country over the long term, or do you see challenges that could stand in the way? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this analysis valuable, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future updates. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.